We're going to get started in a minute. I always start on time. Even if people show up late, that's fine. Everybody, I'll just give some very simple ground rules. There aren't many. This is really a discussion. It's not intended to be a lecture. I didn't get here by telling people things. I got here by listening and learning, and I've been really fortunate that so many people are willing to share. We wouldn't be here today if it weren't for the help of over 300 people. Um, this information I'm going to share will seem simple. I've narrowed it down to about 12 or 13 slides, but it was really 300 people or more that helped me get here. Really helped out all of us. So I leave it to you guys to mute yourself. I don't want to isolate people. If you have a question, throw up your hand. We'll stop right in the middle of the discussion. Um, we are we're we're all on a journey here to solve a bunch of big problems in this industry. I think this issue around leak detection is probably my most fascinating find in a decade, and it's mostly because it wasn't the result I expected. It wasn't even close. Um, all right, with that in mind, let me see if I missed any rules. A little bit about me. I've been doing something in this industry for 32 years. I absolutely love it. I found 32 years ago an industry that was starting to change about the time I was starting to change. And so there were lots of things to learn and share. And I still have many of the same friends from 32 years ago, made some new ones along the way, of course. And in every one of those situations, I think this industry is all about problem solving. And so with that, we're going to get started. Thank you, everybody, for showing up. We're going to talk about something that I really didn't expect: how to reverse 5 trust gaps in refrigerant leak detection. When I started on this journey and I met a bunch of really interesting people, the um, the first thing I thought we'd find is that we needed better leak detectors. And of course we do. The technology's changed immensely. But when we started to litmus test what people were doing and how they were how they were using existing leak detection, we started to find some very interesting problems that had little or nothing to do with the detector. Again, the detector is important, but most of the detectors that have been bought over the last 20 years are systematically untrustworthy for a number of reasons. They don't get maintenance. We'll go through those issues here. But that's led this entire industry to lose faith and confidence in the detectors and the process. So I think there's a way to change that. But what what we're going to highlight are 5 key issues. There are more, and I have some stories, but I like to keep these tight. So let's just jump right in. The first thing we found is that although the detectors are important, it wasn't about the leak. It was about trust. There was a breakdown of trust. The stories are endless of 300 or more site visits that I've been fortunate enough to participate in. I found that over the last 30 years, it wasn't that people were investing in bad technology. They were just investing in technology that didn't fit, or they didn't have a process for it. So the confidence was gone. I can't tell you how many times I walked in to do a leak inspection in a store, and we had our leak detectors out, and we looked at the cabinet. It was just a blank screen off to the right, and I noticed the techs never paid any attention to the leak detection results. And when we did look at them, oftentimes they were plateauing, or they were failing, or they were indicating a leak, but no one was reading it. So the confidence was gone. And really, it started with this statement here on the bottom. That's why we were only seeing about 4% of leaks that were being identified ahead of the leak with leak detectors. And this number actually came from a handful of large mechanical contractors. The average size of these mechanical firms, these refrigeration companies, was well over 80 trucks per company. So we started to see this pattern: East Coast, West Coast, Central. So this was not isolated to an area. And so we talk about the cost of leaks and ROI, but really I want to talk about the cost of leaks and what's happening. The cost of leaks are phantom emissions and missed signals. The sensors are drifting. It's sort of like a Peter and the Wolf issue, where alerts have stopped being taken seriously. And you can really read the rest of it here. But essentially what was happening is we were relying on techs to find leaks during intermittent or periodic leak inspections. We had all these tools and they just weren't being used. And I have very, very few examples where leak detection was was built into a process. There are a couple of good ones out there, actually. And the takeaway from those turns out to be really good integration with people. All right, well, here are the 5 top ones. There are more, but here are the 5 top ones. Something we refer to as phantom emissions and mixed signals. Handheld tools, wands. We're gonna get into that quickly. Um, a lot of diagnostic confusion, a tremendous amount. And this actually was not isolated to just leak detection. This was actually we found this even in companies that had invested in some type of AFDD or alternate leak detection, indirect leak detection technology. We found that when when it wasn't put in the hands of the right people, um, the subject matter experts, that the results were misinterpreted. A lot of sensor drift and a lot of bad placement issues. Last week, I was on an install putting in leak detectors, and I was fascinated by the results. We'll talk about those. And then lastly, siloed teams and flat workflows. This is really important. I do change the term on this slide as I get into the slide, but I like to mention here that we're sending maintenance guys out. When I started in this industry in 1992, there were 250, 300,000 technicians, um, probably 50,000 in refrigeration, and the rest spread throughout air conditioning and industrial process cooling, with industrial process cooling being the smallest group. We had roughly 45, 42, 45 million pieces of equipment by estimate. And today we have roughly 250, 300,000 technicians, and we have about 200 million appliances. In the 90s, we had much more centralized cooling and refrigeration circuits. Now we're much more decentralized, and this decentralization has challenged us because we just don't have enough bodies to do all the work. So we found that teams are pretty isolated. Internal operations teams are isolated from external service teams. External service teams are isolated from the data, and the information is just not getting where it needed to be. All right. So relating back to phantom emissions, what we found is it's important to fix and validate what's real. So use weight-based verification, liquid monitoring. Now, I want anyone to help stop me if you have any questions related to this, because it's important that you understand the difference between phantom emissions and actual emissions. Happy to explain. I'll give it a simple explanation. But phantom emission is something that either isn't really happening, didn't happen, or was misinterpreted. For instance, a good example of a phantom emission is you show a low leak rate, you find a small leak, but even though you only have to add let's say a 20-pound charge of 404 to a system, because the bottle contains 24 pounds, you add all 24 pounds. 20 of those pounds maybe were the leak. The other 4 pounds were not a leak. So it's really understanding the interpretation between the quantity of the leak, the amount you guess added, and the actual leak rate percentage. Now, through the whole process of evaluating data, I saw very little correlation between system charge, um, the amount of the gas leaked, and the actual liquid level. Oftentimes, the liquid levels were set to, let's say, something like 15%, but this is very technical, but it's an important part of what a phantom emission is. Um, what ended up happening is they put in too much gas, so now we had the liquid level up to 20%, but no one was monitoring that liquid level at 20%. Another important area during leak inspections, I noticed this quite a bit, people didn't clean the area after they were done. So they didn't clean the oil residue from under a pan or from under an oil return line. We see a lot of leaks on oil return lines. And you gotta remember that these refrigerants are all, it's like a little chemistry set. You've got oil, acid, water, refrigerant, you get free fluorines, depending on the way the systems are performing, and they start to break down. When those breakdowns happen, they happen at joints. And so we get leaks. And those, it's very easy to pick up an oil residue leak, or a leak that you can see from oil residue, but it's also important to clean it up. So these are minor things. They take time, but they're important. Another one is there was very little implementation of a post validation follow-up. So once the leak was found, the assumption was the leak is done. What we found is that by profiling leaks for about 2 weeks after the leak has been reported as repaired, very important to get the report dates in. The big gap here is that most leaks, when they get repaired, the documentation trails the leak by as much as 2 to 4 weeks. What that means is if Joe fixes the leak on a Monday, he might not get all the billing through and notify the owner-operator, for 2 weeks after that because of the process for getting paperwork through. So it's really important, again, back to the siloed information. It's very important to get that information to the right people. We found this really helped in isolating leaks that had more than just one location. And again, that goes to the second one here as well. Connect the actual leak alerts with actual systems and hold the vendors accountable. What I mean by hold the vendors accountable isn't make them responsible for the leak. It's make them responsible for the pair and the communication, because they're the only set of eyes you've got on that system. Again, phantom emissions, top of mind. It's here for number one for a reason. Number two, it was hard to decide out of all the survey results I had for the year, number one and number two, but these two are competing. The guys are in there out in the field. They've got leak detectors. Sometimes they pull them out of the back of the truck. They're ready to go. They're in their case. They're well maintained. I found that was very infrequent. Most of the time, the leak detectors were sitting in a holster or on a shelf in the truck, and the filter tips hadn't been replaced. There's a little filter that's in there. And in a couple of situations, more than a couple, the leak detector itself wasn't actually the right tool for the refrigerant they were testing. And then lastly, the leak detector might pick up a leak in an area where there is no leak detection on the system. So, and again, this is very important as well. And I think I want to mention a story on this one. This is, number 6. We found a detector that was reporting a leak. This is just a few weeks ago, but we found out that the sensor on the handheld leak detector wasn't working at all. We actually opened a bottle of 404, purged it against the device, and the device didn't go off at all. So this person who was doing the leak detection hadn't actually checked their own leak detector, but they had been doing leak inspections for months on this. And so again, now we have this trust issue. So we have an automatic leak detector that's telling us there's a leak, and then we have a handheld wand, that's showing no leak. And so and these handheld wands are far less sensitive than the fixed leak detectors. The fixed leak detectors are very sensitive. So if they're picking up a leak, they're not picking up ghosts. They're actually picking up a leak. The handheld detectors, and I'm going to get to one other important aspect of this. The handheld detectors, those can do a misreading from time to time. But the key is to interpret the leak on the side of caution. So if you think you have a leak, then you continue to do the investigation in the area. If the leak detector is overly sensitive, then you switch to bubbles. Because a lot of these leak detectors are ultrasonic, and so they're sensing for the transfer of air or pressure. I don't see any questions. I'm going to keep going. But if you have questions, type them in and I'll jump to them. All right. Profile the system, not just the moment. Boy, I learned this lesson from the AKO group out of Spain. This was an interesting lesson. Your leak detector is telling you you've got a leak. You go out, you can't find the leak. Well, the leak might be happening at 8 o'clock at night, and we're not out there at 8 o'clock at night. Well, not intentionally out there at 8 o'clock at night. So what ends up happening is we go to the site 2 o'clock in the afternoon, 9 o'clock in the morning. We can't find the leak. Profiling a system means you have to put the system into a situation where you're recreating the conditions that existed when the leak was picked up, when the leak was sensed. It could be during a defrost cycle. It could be when some knucklehead opens the walk-in door and leaves it open for too long a period of time while they're loading it. And one other situational profile that we found was that some of these leak detectors are susceptible to CO2. So they're built for fluorinated compounds, but we found this in a number of situations, that they are actually susceptible to CO2. So when the CO2 levels in the room rise, the leak detector sends off signals indicating that there's a possible leak. And that leak, when you profile it, doesn't exist. The leak has to do with trucks and the air intake. And I found this out really the hard way about a month ago. We were on site doing a leak inspection. We couldn't figure out why the system was telling us there was a leak, but it was clearly showing a leak at night. We went on site at night to do the evaluation. During the evaluation, we noticed the trucks were running and that the intake fan was working, but the outtake fan in the room wasn't working. So it was the intake fan was right next to the loading dock, and it was pulling CO2 in. So we had a hunch after spending way too many hours on this store, probably 24 hours altogether. And we grabbed the CO2 bottle and we pressed the CO2 bottle within about 3 feet of the detector that was there on site, and we sent some CO2 out. Immediately, the sensor went from 30 ppm to 160 ppm, which was a little shocking. So we didn't want to take that as gospel, so we went and we continued to try that, and we did it for 2 weeks. Turns out that the sensors are susceptible to CO2, and the the shocking thing about that is it now creates additional distrust in the process, and the techs, the guys who I was doing the work with, because I was never alone. I was always with 1, 2, if not 3 people. Um, they were themselves disturbed by the sensitivity of CO2, and that led them further, to have distrust. So it's important that you know exactly how these things are operating. Once we figured out CO2 was the issue, we ignored that leak that we were getting the signals on at night. But none of these things are going to come through in an FDD environment. These are situational things that have to be fed if you are using FDD into an FDD type system. But the key here is this is the part where we talk about reliability in your leak detector. Knowing the leak detector, how does it perform, and where does it perform really well? And you'll see that that's part of the next slide. But the key here is knowing how the system conditions were at the time where that leak was identified. Was the cabinet empty? Was the defrost cycle on? Was there ice buildup? All of these things contribute to how a system will share information with us. So yeah, you cannot just read one thing into the leak environment, information. You really have to understand the situational information. And what we found was really important here, and this was really the most important thing of the last year. You need to pick up the phone and talk to each other. When the guys were doing leak inspections and we were unsure of where a leak was, if they couldn't find the leak, we scheduled a time to be together. So I was there or others were there to answer questions and walk through the leak, and then use examples from other leaks, and then also use the data from the BMS, the energy management system, to profile what was happening. And if there was an FDD system, then use the FDD data as well. All right. I'm 20 minutes in and 7 slides down. No questions. I'm going to continue to plow forward. Nothing. All right. Calibrate, place, and repeat. Okay, this was my last spring. I should have done this discussion, but I was so shocked by the following result that I decided this needed some more investigation. This was really the most shocking thing. I surveyed a whole bunch of people that I've been working with here in the United States for a very long period of time. I asked them to tell me how many calibrations they had on leak detectors throughout the year. Of 37,000 leak detectors, roughly, or 37,000 stores, the number of leak detectors calibrated was under 1,000. And when I asked, in the year cycle, okay, this year you only calibrated 500, 700. How many last year? It was oftentimes the answer from all these people was about the same. Either they didn't do any calibration, or they calibrated the same 500, 700 units, or they calibrated 500 one year and 500 another year. But no pattern to this. As a matter of fact, there's a really interesting story. A company called to hire me to help them buy leak detectors, and they wanted a quote on 4,000 leak detectors. So I asked them, how many leak detectors do you presently own? And they said, we own 700. I said, okay, so you're going to go from 700 to 4,000. How much are you paying for calibration on, like budgeting for calibration annually? And their calibration budget, I want to say, was about $28,000. So I thought, well, that's really low. How many are we actually getting done? Well, it turns out of the stores, the 40 stores that they had, only 7 stores were calibrated. So that $28,000 went pretty quick. The cost for calibration can vary by leak detector company. More advanced technologies are making calibration much easier. I think calibration is incredibly important. I would put it at one of the foundational stones of success here. The more advanced companies are using nitrogen to purge sensors, have very easy setup. The more complicated companies, you have to have a calibrated gas and you have to calibrate the sensor. But then in addition, if you've got one of these older systems with the tubing and the piping and the filters, you actually have to check through all the filters as well. And then you have to make sure that each one of the filters are receiving good quality data, a good quality flow of air through the tubing. And we found when we went out in the field that wasn't always the case. So you had a detector. You were expecting this detector to provide you with results. Think of this detector as your sentry. This is something that's there for you 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, and there's been no maintenance done on it. In the very oldest detectors, I actually worked with a grocer in California. The detector was 17 years. The detectors they were using were 17 years old. They had been out of manufacturing since 2015. That was the last year any parts were manufactured for these detectors. They had never been calibrated, but these were part of their equipment empire that somebody was expecting was providing good results. But the service team was so busy on, doing break fix repairs that, they just assumed the leak detectors were fine. And the answer is they're not fine. You really need to calibrate these. If you're got an older tech and you have to calibrate it with a very highly specific gas that's calibrated to the right amount, you just have to make sure you order those, and you get them in and you have them for that calibration. If you're with a more advanced tech, and there's a few good ones out there, then you can purge these with nitrogen. They're very quick, easy, and once the purge has taken place, or the calibration has taken place and everything's set up, it actually becomes part of the DNA of the device. It actually will indicate that. But it's key to know, do I have this in the right place? We saw leak detectors that were placed 8 feet up on the wall, and I looked back through 3, 5, 7 years of history, whatever they had access to. There was no indication of a leak ever occurring. Um, so that leak detector was probably in the wrong place because that system had been leaking continuously, at least in this one situation. And so what ends up happening is a lot of people look at calibration and say, "Oh, EPA's mandating it. I'll do it on the annual cycle." Hey, the more advanced tech just needs a nitrogen purge. Do it twice a year. It's actually what I found is it's actually better if you do it a couple times a year, then you can rely on the device. It makes the workforce interact with the device and really gain an appreciation for what it can or cannot do. And then lastly, use an internal diagnostics and zero check routine. And what that means is take a look at this device. Is it online all the time? Does it go offline? When it's offline, does it come back online and it's accurate? If it's offline for a long period of time, does it need to be zeroed? And then did it get placed in the right spot? I I gotta tell you, this is where I made my mistakes last week. I was putting, I was, put in a situation where, "Hey, help me determine where to put these leak detectors and move them around." And I said, "Well, put them outside here on this cabinet wall." Well, that wasn't good enough. It had to go in the cabinet, and we had to redo everything. We had to redo the plumbing. We had to strip everything out of the cabinet. This was a display freezer, 80-door display freezer in a grocery store, and we decided, all right, if we have to put them in the cabinet to see if there's a leak, let's go into the middle. Sure enough, we mounted that leak detector. By the way, this leak detector had been returning 0 ppm leak rate outside the cabinet, just outside the cabinet, right where you would think if there was a leak, we're gonna be able to see it, right where the tubing is. We got that leak detector, it mounted inside, plugged it in, turned it on, inside the cabinet. Now this is a freezer cabinet. This is like where ice cream is. As a matter of fact, it's right behind the ice cream. And I'll tell you why in a second. Sure enough, we plugged that in, 12 ppm, 60 ppm, 70 ppm, 80 ppm. Within 30 minutes, it was at 80 ppm. Purged it with nitrogen, re-zeroed it just to verify the result. Bingo. Right back up to 70 ppm. So my novice 32-year instincts of where to place a leak detector couldn't have been more wrong. Once we talked to the powers that be and we got it placed in the right place and we realized the leak detector can survive in that extreme environment, we picked up a leak right away. And what's great about this is the store has been leaking and the company couldn't figure out where the leak was coming from. And we picked novelty ice cream. I'll tell you why. Because years ago, not too long ago, 2 years ago, I worked with a company, and what we found is novelty ice creams, guys my age, people my age, anybody my age, your eyesight's getting harder, but we still love ice cream. So that's the door, the cabinet we're opening the most because we can't read the little tiny labels on the novelty ice cream. So we keep opening and closing this door. And I found that novelty ice cream cabinets are the ones that frost up the most. And I said, well, this isn't my only experience. So if we're going to have to put it inside, let's put it near the novelty ice cream. And sure enough, we did this in a bunch of stores last week. It was very demanding, and it was certainly humbling because I couldn't have been more wrong about where to place these things. But what we found right away was evidence of leaks. And now, of course, we have to pull those cabinets, sweep the lines. We'll find the leak, the specific leak, but we'll use calibrated handheld leak detectors to isolate the specific location of the leak, and we'll use proximity now that we have a much better idea of where it is. Very, very important. All right, now last piece. I've been on 100 phone calls in the last year. Tech is the solution. Tech is the silver bullet. I'm going to tell you, tech is super important. It is, without a doubt, making improvements all the time. Those improvements benefit us. But subject matter experts, I cannot say enough about the power of a subject matter expert here. Interpretation of leaks. I have been on calls where, yes, there's a leak, please go take a look at it. All the indications digitally are that there's a leak. Using indirect leak detection, I've seen it in a number of different cases. A week later, 2 weeks later, through the profiling, the leak goes away. I've seen companies that are ingesting the data in June and then sending back results in July and saying, hey, we think there's a leak here. Timing's everything here, guys. If you're not getting that result back for the tech right away, then he doesn't have time to look at a fresh data impact, like what's happening. Was it the defrost cycle? Also, the guys have to feel confident. They have to know, and they have to have guidance here from somebody who's senior, because a lot of times we send out the younger guys, if they have time and they're new, find the leak. These guys have to know, turn the system off. This is a little bit of an old school way, but if the defrost cycle isn't bumping the pressure enough, turn the unit off, power it down, let the pressures rise. You've got an hour. Use that hour while the pressure's rising to scour the case and cabinet and find the actual leak. If the leak detector, the automatic leak detector is telling you there's a leak, and it will not read negatively, it will not manifest new parts per million. Okay, if you get a new generation leak detector, it will not make fake results. It won't say, hey, you have a high leak level, only to find out that it's the CO2 issue that I talked about earlier. If it's showing a leak, you have a leak. You got to find it. But you're not going to be able to find it unless you can recreate the system conditions that you saw when the leak was detected by the leak detector. We see leaks at night. We see leaks in the morning. I worked with AKO throughout the year, and they have this one guy. He's kind of if you think I'm passionate about leaks, this guy wakes up in the morning and looks at leak detector results, but he's profiled 6 different types of leaks. And we used that insight when we were out installing leak detectors, whether it's a leak from the frost cycle, etc., a splitter valve or something else that's happening, a cabinet leak, a condenser leak. The key is you have to create a feedback loop. He didn't determine these leak profiles by himself. And I worked with, a couple of companies throughout the year. And in every one of the situations, they took the tech and they wanted to elevate or escalate it to a reason to roll a truck. Well, I'm going to tell you this. If your truck rolls aren't effective, your guys won't trust you. And if they don't trust you, then when you tell them there's a leak, they're going to go right back to where they are today in their behavior, and they're not going to believe it. So they're just going to continue to do things the way they've been doing it. We have to break that business as usual pattern, because when we did break that business as usual pattern this year, we found tremendous success at not only identifying, but reducing leaks and avoiding having to install refrigerant. And that's the key. But I would say in some cases, we had differing results. Just the detector alone may only give you about a 20 to 40% comfort level. A detector with some profiling, equipment profiling, I think you can get that number up to 60%. We're still working through these numbers. With a subject matter expert who can guide a person who's skilled at what they do, that number goes to 80%. But you need the subject matter expert. You need the people there. You need a peer system, a buddy system, a mentor system, whatever it is. If it's a centralized system, fantastic. We did see one phenomenal result, Australia, Woolworths, absolutely great. They had good tech, but they had a really great big investment in people. And when we saw that happen, we realized the tech is important, but the people who use the tech are more important in this case, because they can contextualize what's happening and guide the workforce using a feedback loop. And then they can profile that leak for 2 weeks after it's been identified and repaired. It's also important to pay attention to the size of the leak. I noticed that a lot of leak detectors, the detector technology did not take into account the size of the system or the size of the room. Last week, I had the fortune of working with these guys from Spain, and boy, they profiled everything. They wanted to know how many pounds of refrigerant, what was the size of the room, and they wanted to know the type of refrigerant. What they were able to do with that data, when they had a 12 ppm leak in a cabinet that's 80 feet or no more, 200 feet long, they would profile that say, okay, here's your actual leak emission rate. So at a 20 ppm rate, because I have some grocers that are saying when I see 8 or 20 ppm, I rush right out. I'm I'm impressed after last week because these guys would look at this and they'd say, you know what, don't rush out for a 20 ppm leak because that's only 4 pound per year loss rate. You have a bigger leak over here, but you need that profile data on the appliance in order to do this job the right way. You need to know all these other details, which don't often get connected. This is really important because what we found is if you buy a leak detector and you install it, great. And it starts telling you got a 12 ppm leak. 12 ppm of what? 200 pounds, 80 pounds, 500 pounds, 1,500 pounds? So you need all these other pieces of data so that you know the actual extent of the leak and not just that it's 12 ppm of something, right? And this means something to the guys that they don't have to go out on a Friday night. Or hey, I know that it's late in the day on a Thursday, but I need you to make one more stop at the store because I see this 25 ppm leak rate. And when you hold yourself accountable to these really stringent leak limits like 8, 20, and by the way, these are real numbers. These are what I'm seeing from people, 8, 20, 30. If it gets to 50, we want to have 2 guys there. It's like, wait, hold on. Let's profile that. Let's make this a little bit simpler for the guys in the field. I really take the time and the commitment of the field guys seriously because having been in the field, I know what that's like to leave the dinner table, or I know what it's like to slide yourself away from something that you're doing that might be with your family. I know what it's like to leave your wife on a date and have to go somewhere because that type of thing puts a strain on a relationship. So what if we could use this tech? What if we could use this interaction? What if we could use this feedback loop to ensure that we don't dispatch people unnecessarily, but we still find leaks ahead of time? And that's really the thesis and commitment here. And it's actually been one of the best, most interesting years of my entire life. And I'm excited to share this data with you because it's real data that came from real people that wasn't part of some commercial interest and I gotta sell something. It was a whole year off just to be able to look at this. Alright, so what does it look like? I'll tell you, the most important thing I've heard is, "Hey, we had 80% success. We're good, 80% is great." 80% means 20% failure. And I know that might sound like I'm being really critical and tough and structured here, but the reality of it is 20% failure means Joe rides out at night or Mary rides out at night and 1 in every 5 visits she makes is a failure. And I experienced this about a month ago, had a indication of a leak, sent a relatively young guy, newish, look for the leak, couldn't find it, couldn't find it, couldn't find it. Profiled the leak a little bit better, found out the CO2 thing, information's wrong. Bam. Start asking yourself. Now this guy doesn't trust us, but we had to find a root cause. That's why it was so important for me to be on site. I didn't just pick up the phone and call these guys. Like, I gotta get on a plane. I gotta go see what he's looking at. Why are we doing this to him? What did we do? How did we fail him? And because if we fail him and we break that trust bond, I won't find any of those other leaks. I'm convinced of that after seeing thousands and thousands of leak detectors out there and people not trusting the data, that it's about trust. So we went, we found it, and we were able to repair that trust, and that means everything to me. Now, we didn't find a leak, but what we found was the underlying problem that caused the failure in the trust. So bam, big win right there. The other thing that's important here is knowing the context in the ppm level and knowing the difference between sending someone out at 12 or 20, as I said. But when you get that right and you tell them ahead of time, I'm not sure we're going to be able to find this leak. We're profiling it and you're going to have to turn the system off. And they go, okay, I've got this guy Ted's sort of support, whatever that means, to turn the system off. And for younger guys, they don't like to turn them off. I did a whole bunch of site visits, and in front of their boss, they were always, yeah, I turned the system off. And I was like, you turned the system off? You sure? Show me how you turn it off. Well, then it was, oh no, I didn't turn it off. I just told him that. I was like, all right, well, let's turn it off together. I'll be right here with you. I know how to start these things back up. We'll be fine. It might take a minute, but I'm not going to go anywhere. I'll even buy dinner. And sure enough, we did it. time and again, they'd find the leak. They get so excited, they'd call their peers. And these guys are amazing. They'll text each other. They take pictures. They're proud. You should see what happened over time over this last year. Information sharing. It was not a formal information share. It was an informal. It was like, hey, I found my leak. You find yours. But when you did that, we got this peer group together where they were pushing each other to do better. We found fewer phantom emissions. We got better data feedback. And man, I got to tell you, it's really exciting when you find a store that added 250 pounds last year and this year, and they hadn't found the leak. And then this year they haven't added a pound. And we're going into summer. And by now we would have already added some gas because we're seeing those pressures perk up. Primarily, most of the work we're doing is in the salt. But it is. That's the result. That's really the result. I'm telling you, the devices are super important. The tech is out there. But if you take great tech and you put it back into this business as usual process, it won't yield you any better results. You need a team approach to the process. And if you over rely on the data, just the data touch points, I found that it's a failure. You need to contextualize it. And you need to have the subject matter experts in there. And it's also important to note, I didn't mention this, but a lot of detectors were mounted on racks or were mounted in an area that was not really a great spot to mount the detector. And when we pressed on this, we found that the vibration on the rack deteriorated the detector significantly in a very short period of time. And detectors do deteriorate over time. They definitely go bad. They're made by humans. They'll fail. That's what we do. And it's important to know the quality of that. That's why calibrating them is paramount to everything else. But it also creates a bond between the tech and the technology. And that's all I've got, guys. We rushed through that 35 minutes, 40 minutes, but I hope I took advantage of your time well enough that this made some sense. I guess since I know Kelly so well, Kelly, how'd I do? Did I
Oh, thank
I
you.
make the
Really thorough, and you always do a great job. So, you did great.
let's see. Somebody has a question. Well, thanks for that, Kelly. I'm not sure I always do a great job, but I'll keep talking. New York State requires a technician on site within 24 hours of a detected leak. The PPM of whatever size system is irrelevant and could mislead people who do not understand the New York State regulation or count on their team to know the specific New York State regs. If it leaks Friday night, you can't wait until Monday. This is a great point. Most of what I'm talking about here is related to the operational success. There are regulations like New York. I don't 100% agree with the New York model because I think a 110 or 20 ppm leak rate on a 80-pound system. And we're really going to talk separately about the difference between the tiers, the weight structures, 0 to 200, 200, 2000, 2000 and over, or the 1,500-pound level or the 500-pound level. It's important, though, to know what the leak detector is detecting for. Is it set up on a 1,500-pound system? And also, if we're going to add to this, because it's a great statement here, it's important to note that when you do fix a leak, the expectation is that even though you have an automatic leak detector, you are expected to leak test the areas of the system that are not covered by the leak detector. So if you have a leak detector in one one chamber, one evaporator, you'll have to leak check the other chambers manually in order to meet the spirit and the intent of the regulation. All right. All right. So the next step, I'm going to send you guys a thank you and a survey. I'd love to get your answers on the survey. It's not required, but I really do like them, and I'll share the results back out with everybody. I find it's very helpful because this is a feedback loop. Anybody who joined today, you're here because you have a responsibility and clearly are interested in some real world experiences because that's all we're going to bring you here. So I'll share that. If you don't mind responding, I would appreciate it because that way we can share information and we can probably improve. And if there's anybody who has a question, didn't feel like asking it here or didn't remember to ask it here, just send me an email. If I don't have the answer, I'll find an answer. And if you don't like my answer, then we'll open it up to the group and say, hey, anyone have a better answer than this? I'm too old to be too proud to be wrong. It doesn't help get us anywhere. And last week I was about as wrong as you could get. After making everybody install leak detectors, I had to go around, uninstall them and reinstall them. It's far more humbling than just being wrong in front of a group of people that doesn't involve a freezer and 6 hours of work. So I am definitely, I'm definitely vulnerable to being wrong. All right. Everybody, thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate it. I know how valuable
falling
time.
out of our hands. When all of our forests are turning to sand, is there a change we can make? Close